Greetings BookTube, Sean here, hope you're all well and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to take you through a selection of fantasy series that I hope to, let's say, progress with in 2018. Don't want to use the words catch up because that infers that or implies that I'm going to be reading all of these books, all of the outstanding books, and if I did that it would probably dominate my reading life for the next 6 months. So let's just say progress with, and as a bare minimum what I mean by that is I'm going to read at least the next book in the series, because these are all series that I've only read the first book for. So I've got a list of them down here on my tablet and I'm going to be referring down to that, and let's get through them. The first series that I want to talk about is the Dandelion Dynasty series by Ken Liu. This is a series where I read the first book in 2015 when it came out. That's called The Grace of Kings, and The Wall of Storms, the second book, came out last year. There is a third book I think planned, potentially penciled in for the end of this year, but it is untitled so far, so I wouldn't be surprised to see that slip into 2019. But I really enjoyed the first book in this series. It's often pigeonholed as silk punk, which, as far as I can gather, is essentially just high fantasy with a Chinese or East Asian twist. You certainly see some forms of technology that you perhaps wouldn't see in traditional fantasy. So there are battle scenes in the first book where silk airships are slugging it out in the skies above, for example. But the main strength of this series is both in the main protagonists, who in the first book are kind of these two kind of polar opposite characters are drawn together to try and bring down the predominant power of the land, this empire. And the other thing that Ken Liu does excellently is the global and epic scope of this story. So you are watching this action unfold over several years in the first book, but you never feel like you are distant or detached from the characters. I think that's really cleverly done by Ken Liu. The good thing is, as well, normally for fantasy series or any series where I've really enjoyed the first book, I'm approaching the second book with a sense of trepidation, but given that I've seen numerous people on BookTube give The Wall of Storms rave reviews, I'm a little more confident in approaching it with without that feeling of apprehension. Certainly Kitty G on her channel named Wall of Storms her book of 2017, so you cannot get much higher accolades than that. That's the first series. Then the second series is the Traitor Sun series. This is by Miles Cameron. It's a 5-book series, and the good news about this one is that all the 5 books are already out, so I could read through all 5 this year and not have to wait for the next instalment because the series is complete. I read the first book in this series last year. It's called The Red Knight. Not a particularly innovative or groundbreaking novel. It doesn't sort of do anything in terms of innovation in terms of the fantasy genre, a lot of stuff that I'd already seen before, but it does it very well, and I really enjoyed the kind of air of mystery and charisma around the main character, the eponymous Red Knight. I think I'm hoping that the second book, The Fell Sword, when I got onto it, starts to unveil a little bit more about his history, because so much is unknown at the end of the first book. And the other thing that I really liked about it was it much like Legend by David Gemmell, a book that I've mentioned as a childhood favourite of mine on this channel more than once. It is based around a siege, and it was done really well in terms of the tension, the claustrophobia, and the paranoia that creeps in that kind of siege mentality as the ring closes in and parts of your outer defences start to fall. I thought that was done really well. The third series that I want to talk about is The Song of the Shattered Sand by Bradley Beaulieu. I read the first book, which is called The 12 Kings in Sharakai, in 2015. The second book came out last year, which is called With Blood Upon the Sand. And the third book, A Veil of Spears. We don't have to wait all that long for that because it's out in March of this year. I think in lazier hands, this story could have become a little bit cliched and tropey. It could have turned into a very sort of standard revenge story, a fantasy revenge story, where because you're following the main character Cheda, who is, when you meet her at the beginning of the first book, a sort of pit fighter, a gladiator, and the book follows her story of how she then becomes motivated to take down these 12 kings who rule over this desert state she lives in, because they were responsible for the death of her mother. And as I say, that could be very cliched, but the way that Beaulieu handles it with the characterisation, particularly of Cheda herself, but also Emre, her best friend, and some of the other supporting cast, and the way that he does the world building, because you are mainly in this one desert city for the entirety of the book, that allows him to embellish and add nuance to the world that you may not get if it was more of a kind of epic scaled book. But he does give you enough about other parts of the world to kind of wonder and be intrigued, and hope that in the second book you are going to get to find out a bit more about these other lands that sit outside of the city. So that's that one. The fourth one, and it's probably not going to be a surprise, I'm going to be joining the mass ranks of people who review fantasy and talk about fantasy on BookTube in heaping praise on this series, and it's the Mistborn Trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. I read the first book in this series, The Final Empire, last August, and loved it. It was a strange reading experience in some ways, because I had this strange mental dissonance between knowing that the book was flawed and understanding what some of its flaws were, but also being dragged along by the story at such a pace and with such kind of joyous escapism that the flaws in the book became immaterial. And particularly in the last 150 pages of this book, Sanderson manages to maintain this kind of gripping tension that doesn't let you go until the story is resolved. And I just absolutely loved it. I can't wait to pick up The Well of Ascension, which I'll be picking up in late January, which is the second book. And the third book, The Hero of Ages, I'll be picking up before the end of March. So this is a series that I do definitely plan to conclude in 2018, and then I can perhaps have a look around for which Brandon Sanderson novel or trilogy I go for next. The fifth in this list is the Gentleman Bastard series by Scott Lynch. There are 3 books out for this series at the moment, out of a total of 7 planned books. And the first book, The Lies of Locke Mora, I read in 2016. So this is a kind of combination of, if you've ever seen the BBC TV series The Hustle, which followed around a series of conmen and conwomen as they moved from one mark to the next, and each of them had their own specialisations. This is kind of that transposed into a fantasy city-state. It's about a bunch of conmen who are always coming up with schemes to try and basically part the rich nobles of the city from their cash and disappear away into the night. So, and it's about how they become, through the course of the first book, enmeshed in the politics and the criminal underworld in ways that they certainly didn't intend, and in ways that are quite fatal. And I just thought it was really well done. It's nice to see fantasy series where sometimes problems are not resolved by force of arms or by some magic or something like that, and it's about people living on their wits. And I thought it had a great central friendship as well, the 2 main sort of characters. I thought it was a great sort of bromance, if you like, I guess. So that's the Gentleman Bastard series. The next one in the series that I need to pick up is it's called Red Seas Under Red Skies. If I get through that and get a chance to get to the third one's called The Republic of Thieves. The next series is the Book of Ancestors series. So last year I read the first in this series. It was also my first Mark Lawrence book. Again, this is not particularly a groundbreaking or innovative series. It very much relies on that now standard kind of Harry Potter-esque, a load of young kids turn up in a magical school and get trained kind of trope. But I thought it was really well done, and the first book leaves it on such a cliffhanger. I can't wait to get to the second book, which is not out, unfortunately, until May, so a bit of a wait. But it follows an orphan called Nona, and she, at the beginning of the book, is kind of shipped off to this convent. Of course, it's not your standard convent that you just go along to for spiritual kind of guidance or teachings. It's also a convent where they train you in how to kill people. It's run by an order of assassin nuns, and I really just loved the main character, kind of Nona, who's a kind of wild and rough and the way that during the course of the first book she started to build up some really strong friendships with some of the other girls in the convent, and it's really, the plot moves at pace, and as I said, it left it on a massive cliffhanger at the end of the first book. So looking forward to the second book. But leaving the best till last, the final series on my list is one that the second book of this series, which is coming out later this year, is one of my most anticipated reads of 2018. I cannot wait for this book to come out. Unfortunately, it's not out until September or October time. The series is the Baru Cormorant series by Seth Dickinson. I read the first book in this series, The Traitor, Baru Cormorant, in 2015. The second book, as I say, should be out in September, October. It's called The Monster Baru Cormorant. And this, when I read the first book in 2015, it's certainly the best fantasy book that I've read since I restarted reading fantasy in 2015, if not the best fantasy book that I've read ever, or one of them. And it's a very strange book to read. At times it didn't feel like I was reading a fantasy book. It felt like I was reading a political psychodrama almost. And it's so kind of gripping and involved that it's basically based around the main character called Baru. He lives in this world where many of the countries have been kind of conquered and their cultures have been suppressed by this kind of Roman-style empire, and everybody's expected to assimilate into the culture of this predominant empire. So it has some things to say about colonialism. The main character comes from a kind of island that has been conquered and suppressed, and it is about the way she insinuates herself into the kind of civil service, the administration of this empire, to try and use its own kind of structures and institutions against it to bring it down from the inside. But it's a very kind of subtle novel. You are never sure where the political alliances are going to end up landing. You are never quite sure whether Baru herself is in charge of events and driving them forward, or whether it's the other way round and circumstances are pushing her. Similarly with her emotions, you are never sure whether she has got them in check and is acting these things out, or whether her emotions are actually running away with her. And it's just a fascinating novel. Even I would suggest for people who are not normally into fantasy. And I can't wait for the second book to come out. And the ending of the first book, in terms of emotional impact and kind of sheer visceral brutality, is far more impactful than anything that the Game of Thrones could ever throw out, that's for certain. So if you've not read this book, go and pick it up in advance of the second book coming out in September or October. I guarantee, sort of, that you won't regret it. Okay, that's it for the list. Just wanted to talk about two final things, which are the two series I want to start this year. The first one is the Farseer Trilogy, and I have got the first book. This is by Robin Hobb. Would be my first Robin Hobb, and it starts with The Assassin's Apprentice. There's a trilogy, but the trilogy itself is part of a wider series of books called The Realm of the Elderlings. I think there are 17 altogether. And I've only ever seen good things about Robin Hobb on BookTube, even from people that don't normally read fantasy, or fantasy is not their main thing. I've seen great reviews of this, so I intend to pick up and start my first Robin Hobb trilogy this year. And the second one, again driven largely by reviews on BookTube, is The Traitor's Blade, which is the first in the Greatcoats trilogy, or is it may be 4 books actually that were in this series, but it's by Sebastian De Castell. Again, seeing great reviews on BookTube, and hope to pick this up maybe in the middle of the year and get through the rest of the books in the series if I can. I think this is supposed to be a kind of influenced by the Three Musketeers from what I know, with a great deal of humour and kind of sword play in it. So those are the series I plan to start. That's it from me. What sort of fantasy series do you plan on starting or continuing with in 2018? Have you read any of these, and do you have any opinions on them? Obviously don't leave me any spoilers. Other than that, I will see you in my next video. Take care in the meantime and enjoy your reading. Bye.